So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on working with incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors of sexual abuse. As we begin today's webinar, it would be great to get a sense of where people are joining us from. If you would like to put your name, pronouns, organization, and state and territory in the chat, you are more than welcome to do so. And while you're doing that, I do want to say we are really excited to be presenting this webinar. We originally planned it in honor of Pride Month, and many places around the country and around the world do celebrate Pride throughout the year. We can still bring that energy and appreciation into this presentation today, while also keeping in mind that incarcerated folks are often left out of Pride. Again, if you want to drop your name, pronouns, organization, state, and territory in the chat, you are welcome to do so. And it's already great to see that folks are joining from around the country. And as you continue to introduce yourselves, we will introduce ourselves. My name is Layla Dost. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer with Just Detention International. I am a former Rape Crisis Center advocate, and I'm also a member of JDI's Survivor Council, and I'm really glad to be here with you all today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole, and I will pass things over to her.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole de la Torre. I use she, her pronouns. And I have been with JDI for about going on 14 years here. So it's nice to see some familiar names joining us today, and excited to meet those of you I don't know. Yeah, really happy to be here today, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, thanks, Nicole. Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI carries out this mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis center advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The fundamental principle behind JDI's work is that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. This webinar is one of a 13-part series focused on providing accessible services for currently and formerly incarcerated survivors who are from particularly underserved groups. If you're not already on our mailing list, please send us your name and email in the chat, and we'll add you so you don't miss announcements on future webinars. And this webinar is made possible because of generous support from the Office on Violence Against Women. We want to give a big thank you to the OVW for being a part of the work that we do. So during this webinar, we will be highlighting survivor stories and sharing a video of a survivor. As always, we want to remind you to take care of yourselves during and after this training, whether that means taking a break, getting up to stretch, drinking water, having a snack, going off camera, whatever you need to do, we encourage you to do so. You might see Nicole and I go off camera while the other person's speaking. So just whatever you need to take care of yourself, please do that. And let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to go over some of the specific challenges that lesbian, gay, seeing that you're not able to hear me. I'm really sorry to hear that. I'll try to get closer. I'm in Northern California and it's super hot here, and I do have the fan and AC blasting. So I'm hoping that if I get a little closer, you can hear me. Okay. Today, we are going to go over some of the specific challenges that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people face in and out of detention settings. We will discuss the dynamics of sexual abuse experienced by lesbian, gay, and bisexual people when they are in detention. And we will go over some tips and best practices that advocates can use in their work with incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. We will also have time for questions at the end. Again, our focus today is on the LGB. You may be familiar with seeing the acronym LGBT or LGBTQ+, with the T representing transgender people. We want to be clear that when we talk about lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in this webinar, this includes both cisgender people who identify with the sex assigned at birth and transgender people who do not. Sexual orientation is not the same as gender identity. We will also be discussing dynamics primarily in terms of men's and women's facilities, as this reflects the binary nature of detention settings, with the understanding that people of various genders and sexual orientations are typically housed according to their sex assigned at birth. Regarding the needs of incarcerated transgender survivors, we recommend you check out our previous webinars working with incarcerated transgender men survivors of sexual abuse and working with incarcerated transgender women survivors of sexual abuse, which will both be posted on our website along with all of our previous webinars soon. So be on the lookout for that. And in the meantime, if you have any specific questions about working with incarcerated transgender or LGBTQ+ survivors, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And I will pass things over to Nicole.
Thanks, Layla. So we're going to go ahead and get started by talking a little bit more about the issue of today's webinar and what are some of the things that really lead lesbian, gay, and bisexual people to be disproportionately incarcerated and what some of the challenges that they experience might be. So Layla already talked a little bit about language, but if you've joined any of our webinars, you know that we always like to make a note about language. The language that we use and why we use it. At JDI, we believe that JDI is, that language is one of the steps to culture change. And so with that, when we talk about people and discuss issues, we like to use language that is reflective of where things are at and what's respectful of the people that we're talking to. So we choose to use person first language. We know that a lot of the statistics and reports that are out there don't always use that person first language. So we just want to be mindful of that. But we, for example, will be using a person who is incarcerated or person incarcerated or survivor incarcerated instead of inmate, for example. And we will be using the term survivor rather than victim. And as Layla mentioned, we're going to be using the term lesbian when we refer to a woman who has same-sex relationships with other women, and gay when we're referring to men who have same-sex relationships with men, and then bisexual people, which includes both men and women who have sexual relationships with both men and women. To be clear, again, when we talk about men and women today, we're including, as Layla said, transgender and cisgender men and women, because the population we're talking about today is defined by their sexual orientation, not their gender identity. We're talking about sexual minorities and not straight people. Of course, we also understand that gender and sexuality are spectrums, and so the language we're using today may not reflect all the diverse identities and experiences which may encompass lesbian, gay, and bisexual identifications. So just want to note that as well. And today's webinar, of course, it's not intended to be sexual orientation 101. So we encourage you, as Layla said, to check out some of our previous trainings, but also to pursue your own learning around sexualities and identities that are reflected in the communities that you're serving. Okay, so we're going to turn things back over to you now. And if you wouldn't mind, we have a question for you, a share out. Why do you think it's important to specifically talk about the experiences of incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors? And you can just send some thoughts on the chat. There is You don't need to do full sentences. Quick little thoughts are totally fine. But yeah, we want to hear from you. Why do you think it's important to specifically talk about the experiences of incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors? And I'll give you all a couple of seconds to see what you think. Don't be shy. Who's going to be brave? Okay. I guess we'll have to do all the work here today. Okay, thanks. Because we need to know how they're feeling, because to bring awareness to their experience, yeah, definitely. Because they're a vulnerable population. They're individuals that often are forgotten, yes, because they're marginalized and have a hard time receiving services. Absolutely, they're all great. All right, thank you to those of you that gave us some answers. Those are all great responses. And yeah, absolutely. We know that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people face ongoing social stigma and that they're targeted for sexual violence. Despite civil rights progress that we've made, like marriage equality, we know that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, they still face a lot of ongoing discrimination from our heteronormative society that we live in. And we know that includes damaging stereotypes, harassment, workplace discrimination, and denial of opportunities. We'll look at some data later in the webinar around rates of sexual abuse, but we know that rates of sexual abuse in this particular population are really high, and that's both inside and outside of correctional settings. We also know that lesbian, bisexual, and gay people are incarcerated at higher rates than heterosexual people. And in fact, they're overrepresented at every stage of the criminal legal system. So we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of prison pipeline shortly. And in addition to the high rates of abuse, once inside, incarcerated LGB people also are more likely to face disciplinary actions in custody at higher rates than their heterosexual peers. They're seen as looking for trouble or asking for that. Okay, let's take a look at some overall numbers around the prevalence of sexual abuse among the population that we're talking about. So this data comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, specifically the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And this data is not specific to incarcerated people. We'll take a look at that in a little bit. Here, we wanted to just show how lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are impacted by sexual abuse even before entering correctional facilities. So you can see almost 80%, or about 4 in 5 bisexual women and over 56% of bisexual men reported experiencing contact sexual violence in their lifetimes. And 3 in 5, or almost 60% of both lesbian women and gay men reported experiencing contact sexual violence. So again, just really high numbers. And numbers that aren't reflected on here, but I wanted to share as well from that report. More than 1 in 4 lesbian women and almost 2 in 4 bisexual women reported to researchers that they had experienced rape in their lifetime. About a quarter of gay men, 25 versus 3% of heterosexual men, reported to researchers that they had experienced rape during their lifetime. Again, just very high numbers of sexual violence. Let's take a look at some of the factors that lead to the disproportionate representation of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in jails and prisons. We know that LGBT youth face harassment and bullying at really high rates in school, especially nowadays with cyberbullying and social media. And these are things that make youth fearful and ashamed to be in school. The harassment and bullying, along with discriminatory policies that a lot of schools across the country still hold, make the LGBT youth be in more contact with school administration, and it increases their risk of being disciplined. So at the end of the day, we just have a lot of LGBT youth that are being pushed out of school for all those reasons. Likewise, at home, they're being shunned by their families when they come out. They might lose the financial and social support systems that They need to be safe. We know that LGBT youth specifically face higher rates of homelessness than the general population, again, often due because of that rejection from their families. And then we also see that they are discriminated against in crisis centers and shelters. So again, forcing them to be unhoused many times. And as far as the sort of workforce, we know that lesbian and bisexual women face misogyny and gender inequity, such as the gender wage gap, of course, which leaves lesbian couples or lesbian households to earn far less than straight or even same-sex male households. In addition, we know that anti-lesbian and anti-bisexual discrimination is rampant in the workforce. Lesbian and bisexual women with more masculine presentation face additional stigma for the expected gender norms of the workplace. And this may lead to prejudicial treatment and denial of opportunities for them to advance. Gay and bisexual men who represent a more effeminate or flamboyant manner or otherwise defy the norms of masculinity are also subjected to additional anti-gay discrimination and harassment in the workforce. So again, just unequal access to opportunities and resources when it comes to employment. And as I already mentioned, but all of these things, especially the being pushed out of school, the rejection from family, unequal employment opportunities, can all lead to a person living in poverty and to be unhoused. Because of that, we know that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people experiencing these particular challenges often have to resort to the underground economy in order to survive, engaging in criminalized activities such as sex work, substance use, or sale, which all lead to an increased likelihood that they have encounters with law enforcement, that they're arrested and incarcerated. And as we previously mentioned, we know that this population faces higher rates of sexual violence than heterosexual people. They also face higher rates of verbal harassment and physical abuse and assault. Basically, LGBT discrimination is just often the backdrop, unfortunately, of our society. From anti-gay jokes that we hear on a regular basis to Supreme Court cases which are permitting folks to deny services to LGBT people. The reality is that anti-LGBT attitudes and anti-LGBT violence remain pervasive in our society. And so incarcerated people, specifically LGBT people, face the same discrimination when they're trying to re-enter after being incarcerated. There's few support services and shelters or halfway houses that cater to the needs of LGBT people. And so without that stability needed to move forward in life and meet their probation and parole requirements, re-entering for LGBT people, it's often set up for them to fail and ultimately leads to recidivism or them going back into the system. Yeah, so we've mentioned already that LGBT people are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And here's data that's was compiled by the Prison Policy Institute that shows some of the actual rates of arrest for straight people versus LGBT people. And so you can see the disparity, particularly in the first two columns, which are the arrest for straight women versus lesbian and bisexual women, but even also for men, so the straight men versus gay and bisexual men. You can see that straight people are arrested at much lower rates than lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. All right, so we've got all that background now. Let's talk about some of the sort of characteristics of detention and really set the stage a bit for what this means for LGBT people that are in our system. So we know that men's prisons are often characterized by a hyper-masculine environment where traditional notions of masculinity are emphasized and enforced. We know that the prison culture is often one of violence and aggression, where femininity and homosexuality are seen as weaknesses to be targeted for sexual violence. Women prisons are also a place where people are expected to adhere to gender norms, where someone who might be a little more butch or masculine are targeted for discrimination and abuse. And this is not just from other incarcerated people, but from staff as well. Research from the American Journal of Public Health highlighted that sexual minorities were, quote, significantly more likely to have experienced administrative or punitive segregation than were straight inmates. These punishments, which include solitary confinement, have severe negative effect on prisoners' well-being and are related to adverse health and mental health outcomes, the study found. As we've talked about, if you've joined us for other webinars in this series, we've talked about some of the deeply rooted racism that exists, and we're actually going to have some webinars specifically around supporting Black men and Black women. But you know that the sort of detention or criminal justice system that we live in has deeply rooted racism and anti-LGBTQ discrimination. So these are all things that are impacting the lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks that are entering our system. But we also know that folks might identify with multiple of these marginalized identities, which makes them puts them at even higher risk for all of these discrimination and sexual abuse and harassment. You can have someone who is a Black gay man, and so that puts them at higher risk for being targeted. All right, so with that, we wanted to share a video that was featured as part of a New York Times op-ed that JDI was involved in. And so bear with me, I'm gonna try to share my screen without causing too much interruption here. All right, and please let me know, our panelists interrupt if you can't see or hear it, but hopefully this works. Of course, it's not working. All right, let me try again. One of those things where we test it and test it again. And when you're live, all right, I think it's going to work this time. So let me try again.
He's the one who famously said, "I'd take a bullet for Donald Trump." Now that he's looking at prison time, we'll see if he's willing to take a dick.
People think that prisoners deserve whatever they get. Police report described him as 5'9" and 140 pounds. Or as his cellmate put it, just right.
I was forced to perform oral sex on several inmates. I was told, "You aren't going to fight back, are you, sweetness?" You're going to be going back to the shower. And the only speed you're going to reach is 88 dudes per hour. Someone's going through that. Someone's going through that right now. And to make a joke about it, it's a slap in the face. Being raped or sexually assaulted in prison is not part of the punishment. No one deserves that. We're still human beings. There's no guards that sit right here. There's nothing. There was nothing. It's like they had to come from way over here, which is the booking area, to come and see anything that was going on in here.
Hey,
Frank, what the hell are you doing in here?
shower time.
What are you doing with that loofah?
Don't worry about it.
I was taking a shower, and in comes a guy. You told me not to worry about it. He says, "Bitch, face the fucking wall, or I'll break your fucking neck." I felt like I didn't even exist. I was just there. My bunk was tapped by a guy, then explained to me that he owned me. He had purchased me from the guy who anally raped me for $20 worth of commissary items. And I was now his property. He was my prison husband. If he wanted to utilize me to pay off gambling debts, I could be bartered. Talking to staff would have been the end of my life. Staff actually came on the tier, and my husband was saying, "Oh, watch what I can make my hold." And he made me dance for him and the staff members. So they all laughed about it. Staff shook his head and walked out the door. Like, "Oh man, y'all crazy."
Next up is Pearl, aka Lil Bitch. I wonder who Big Bitch is.
That would be me.
Lucky you.
I had to sit down and urinate. I had to face the wall to shower. I was not allowed at any point in time to have any mention of me being a man or having a penis. I had to wear a tucker to pull back the genitals to give the appearance of a vagina. It's extremely painful to wear most of the time. I had to wear it all the time. It may just be as simple as me raising my voice and getting smacked to me referring to myself as a he and getting punched. Any type of deviation from his rules were I lost me here. I lost my humanity here. I lost my identity here. I lost myself here. And so the memories are coming back to you mad, and I'm angry at the building. It's a weird feeling. And the people who can make the change, who can affect the change, make jokes about it. If the story's heard and it's addressed and we can stop making the joke of it, someone won't have to go through this one day. Someone can go to prison, do their time. They can rectify their mistake. They can get their second chance. We have to start thinking of it like that. They're people. They are just people. And no person deserves that.
I know we'll get our slides back up. Oh, there they are. Thank you so much. But yeah, I want to just thank, first of all, Rodney for sharing his story with the world. But I think this video really encompasses, and his experience touches on so much of what we're going to be talking about today. And I think, again, just to reiterate what we've already talked about around our society just being so anti-LGBT and using prisoner rape jokes as jokes that they're not, right, in the first place, and how even though our culture has definitely been moving against that rape joke culture from the past, I think when it comes to folks who are incarcerated, we don't see the same level of awareness around some of these topics. It's still okay to say, don't drop the soap when one of our politicians gets arrested. We still hear these things regularly. And again, just wanted to highlight, I think this video really covers it. Yeah, we don't want to continue to tokenize sexual violence because it erases the realities that folks are living every day and how awful it actually is. With that, I will pass things back to Layla.
Thank you, Nicole. And I just want to give a reminder, if you're still having trouble hearing me, please make sure your volume is turned up locally as well. All right, now we will explore some of the experiences of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people during incarceration and what life is like for them in custody. But before we deepen our discussion, we would like to give all of you a chance to share in the chat what you think some of the specific challenges gay, lesbian, and bisexual people face during incarceration. So take a moment to think about that. You might consider some of the barriers to care and equality that exist in society at large that Nicole discussed earlier, and imagine how that might be magnified in detention settings. You might think about Rodney's story that we just saw. So please do feel free to share in the chat some of your thoughts around challenges specific to lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks in custody. Someone mentioned in the chat that folks are not able to come out as their true authentic selves while incarcerated. Yes, that is a really great point, and we'll be talking more about that as well. There's a lot of fear for folks around coming out and expressing who they are. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, harassment by staff and other incarcerated people, lack of empathy. Someone mentions not being able to imagine what it's like, but having experience through film, media, and shows like Orange is the New Black. Okay. Yeah, we'll be talking more about things as well, but some media portrayals can be relatively accurate. Harassment by peers, they may be abused and not able to say anything or defend themselves. Yeah, a lot of fear of retaliation, a lot of coercion. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your responses. And a lot of what you've mentioned in the chat are also things that we've heard time and time again from incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks as well. So when we're speaking about incarcerated LGBT people, we must first address their overrepresentation in jails and prisons, which Nicole touched on as well. According to a 2011-2012 National Inmate Survey, roughly 1/3 of incarcerated women identify as lesbian or bisexual. And when we include all women who have had same-sex sexual activity prior to incarceration, the numbers increase to 42% of the prison population and 36% of women in jail. For perspective, this is compared to 3% of women who identify as lesbian or bisexual in the general US population, which is a staggering difference. And we can reflect on some of the causes which may lead to the disproportionate representation of lesbian, bisexual women in detention settings that we have previously discussed. Just like Nicole was mentioning, it's really important for us to note the misogyny of our society with women, especially women of color, earning substantially less than men. And this, coupled with a sexual minority status, can push lesbian and bisexual women into poverty, homelessness, and participation in underground economies in order to survive. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, lesbian and bisexual women are over 4 times more likely than heterosexual women to be arrested. And again, as we touched on, it's important to note that women who do not adhere to gender norms of femininity, such as masculine women or butch women, are more likely to be perceived as dangerous or threatening. And Black, Indigenous, and women of color, especially those who are lesbian or bisexual, are exponentially impacted by systemic oppression and vastly overrepresented in jails and prisons. We can also see the disproportionate representation of gay and bisexual men in jail and prison custody. According to the previously mentioned survey, approximately 9% of men in prison and 6% of men in jail identify as gay, bisexual, or otherwise engaging in sex with men. This is compared to 4% of men in the general US population. And according to the Prison Policy Initiative, gay and bisexual men are 1.35 times as likely to be arrested as straight men. To put this in perspective, we can consider that 90% of incarcerated people are men, which according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics amounts to over 1.1 million men incarcerated in state and federal prison. Reflecting on the statistics on this slide, out of that number, the percentage who report being gay or bisexual is over 100,000 men. The number of gay and bisexual men in state and federal prison is actually higher than the total number of women in state and federal prison, which is roughly 88,000 women, according to 2022 BJS data. And this is all to say that by the numbers, gay and bisexual men comprise a significant population of incarcerated people. And again, we can consider some of those causal factors at play that may push gay and bisexual men, especially gay and bisexual men of color, into interactions with law enforcement, arrest, and incarceration out of survival needs and lack of equal access to opportunities. And just as mentioned, gay and bisexual men who are considered femme or effeminate or flamboyant face added social stigma, othering, and rejection from families and communities when compared to masculine, gay, or bi men who can pass as straight. And all these factors may lead to gay and bisexual men to engage in criminalized activities in order to survive and cope with stigma and trauma. So just like some of you have mentioned in the chat, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are more likely to experience abuse, including physical and sexual abuse and verbal harassment at the hands of both peers and staff during their time in custody. Due to discriminatory staff perceptions, incarcerated LGBT people often face excessive disciplinary responses compared to their heterosexual peers, including being charged with violations or placed in administrative segregation. This extends to LGBT people being charged with consensual sex, which is consensual sex between incarcerated people, not staff, which can never be consensual. Consensual sex is a rule violation in detention and can come with significant disciplinary infractions. LGBT people are more likely to be seen as sexually aggressive and punished accordingly. And as Nicole mentioned, sexual minorities are more likely to experience solitary confinement than the incarcerated heterosexual population. Additionally, LGBT people may be targeted by abusive PREA reporting, where false allegations of sexual abuse are used by peers, including partners or ex-partners, as retaliation or even to obtain a housing change. Often when a report is received, the suspected perpetrator of abuse is placed in administrative segregation. And unfortunately, due to deprivation and lack of control over circumstances, incarcerated people may resort to false PREA reporting to regain power and meet their needs. Incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are often sexually objectified or sexualized by peers and staff, a reflection of the way sexual minorities are pathologized and viewed as deviant and oversexed by the dominant society. This may include expectations that LGBT people are more promiscuous, willing to exchange sex for goods or services, or are otherwise desirous of any and all sexual attention. These biases may lead to sexual abuse not being recognized or taken seriously by staff, along with perpetration of abuse by staff. And it's also really important to note that intimate partner violence is prevalent in same-sex relationships in custody. Incarcerated LGBT people are more likely to have experienced childhood abuse and sexual abuse prior to incarceration. Without access to the tools and resources to address trauma and steeped in an environment of misogyny, hypermasculinity, and domination, incarcerated LGBT people may repeat the cycles of violence they have been exposed to, enacting domestic violence such as physical, emotional, verbal, and sexual abuse with their partners while in custody. Here again, discriminatory views of LGBT people may lead to the failure of correction staff to recognize intimate partner violence dynamics or to downplay the reported abuse. And let's take a look at some of the specific experiences of sexual minority women in custody. As we've mentioned, lesbian and bisexual women are more likely to be targeted for abuse by peers and staff and face higher rates of disciplinary action. Lesbian and bisexual women, especially those who are masculine or gender nonconforming, may face additional targeting and discrimination for not adhering to gender norms. Lesbian and bisexual women may have their relationships and sexual orientation status documented in their custody files for review by the parole boards as well. Parole boards generally expect gender norms such as ladylike behavior from the women before them and may view sexual minority status as at odds with their expectations of rehabilitated behavior. Another dynamic, which is specific to women's prisons, are prison families, which are complex family structures formed by incarcerated women. These structures often include roles of mother, father, grandparents, siblings, and extended family, and are considered a social coping strategy and a structured form of resource sharing. Some family structures do include sexual elements, and they may also conceal sexual exploitation or other forms of abuse, such as if the father of the family is expecting sexual favors from other family members in the group. This also underscores how sexual abuse lesbian and bisexual women experience is typically less physically violent and more coercive than abuse that gay and bisexual men experience in men's facilities. This includes dynamics that may appear consensual, which makes the abuse more difficult to detect. Lesbian and bisexual women are also objectified in very specific ways, with their sexuality often co-opted for heterosexual male consumption, which extends to staff perceptions and staff abuse. Because lesbian and bisexual women are sexualized and perceived as sexually deviant by staff, they're more likely to be perceived as perpetrators of abuse. And these misperceptions can impact how staff respond to reports of sexual abuse and how false reporting may specifically target lesbian and bisexual women. It's also important to keep in mind that until recent decades, misperceptions of women's sexuality and women perpetrators led many corrections staff to believe that women cannot sexually assault other women, and that peer-on-peer abuse was not an issue in women's facilities, both of which are untrue. Some of these beliefs are still prevalent today, which contribute to more abuse going unrecognized in women's facilities, where according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, peer-on-peer sexual abuse is 3 times higher than in men's facilities. And then, as mentioned, men's jails and prisons generally present a hypermasculine environment where non-normative sexuality or gender identity is perceived as a weakness and targeted for physical and sexual violence. Anti-gay and anti-bisexual attitudes are prevalent among staff and peers. And this targeting for violence is why gay and bisexual men, especially those perceived as more feminine, may enter into survival dynamics to keep themselves safe. We have heard reports of widespread beliefs in the criminal justice system that gay and bisexual men are supposedly happy to be housed in men's prisons and jails. These discriminatory beliefs can impact how gay and bisexual men are perceived by parole boards as well. And these attitudes also extend to trial and sentencing. There have even been instances where gay men were given the death penalty due to beliefs that their placement in men's prison would not suffice as punishment. These entrenched biases erase the reality that gay and bisexual men are disproportionately targeted for sexual violence by both corrections staff and peers. Gang violence is also more prevalent in male facilities, and gay and bisexual men are specifically targeted for abuse and exploitation, such as being sexually trafficked, trafficked to repay debts or barter for goods and services, extortion, and domination, often under the threat of physical violence, death, or harm to their families. Many gay and bisexual men live in constant fear of harassment, sexual violence, and physical assault. We receive numerous reports from incarcerated gay and bisexual survivors who write or call us expressing that they were specifically harassed or targeted for their sexual identity. And it's abundantly clear to advocates that detention is not paradise for gay and bisexual men, and these attitudes must be challenged whenever they arise. The degree of targeting that gay and bisexual men experience forces them to enter into sexually abusive relationship dynamics in order to survive and protect themselves. And we'll explore that more in greater detail shortly. Oops. There we go. All right, a little bit about PREA. The intent of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, is to keep everyone in custody safe from sexual violence, regardless of sexual orientation. PREA also recognizes that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and the LGBTQI+ community as a whole are at disproportionate risk for sexual violence in detention settings and includes standards to address this. The PREA standards require corrections staff to be trained to provide professional communication with incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. Despite this requirement, we still hear reports of staff using degrading language and anti-gay slurs with incarcerated LGB people, revealing that discrimination from staff is pervasive in correction facilities. The standards also provide specific language around screening for those who are or are perceived to be LGB during intake, noting the heightened risk factor to even be seen as lesbian, gay, or bisexual in detention. The screening is intended to keep lesbian, gay, and bisexual people safe in terms of housing arrangements and access to programming. Despite this, it's understandable that many LGB people may not feel safe to disclose their identity to correction staff due to concerns of discrimination or targeting. Additionally, corrections staff may be relying on their own biases or prejudicial beliefs to assess whether someone is perceived as LGB, and perceptions may certainly vary from staff person to person. The PREA standards state that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people cannot be housed separately or kept in segregation solely due to their identity or sexual orientation, unless that separate housing is the result of a legal settlement, legal judgment, or consent decree. We have heard of facilities having success with such housing arrangements resulting from legal action. However, we've also heard many reports of LGB people being kept in administrative segregation or isolation due to their identity, especially after they report sexual abuse. And as Nicole mentioned, there's a lot of studies that show how detrimental that can be to mental and physical health, especially with a population already impacted by mental illness. PREA also states that consideration should be given as to whether a survivor's lesbian, gay, or bisexual identity or perceived identity may have been a factor in their abuse during investigations. Ideally, staff would inquire about a survivor's sexual orientation in a respectful manner and work with the survivor to help keep them safe from further abuse. However, some LGB survivors come up against dismissive or victim-blaming attitudes from staff after their sexuality is taken into consideration. We'll be discussing the ways you as advocates can support LGB survivors around PREA in a later section, but for now, I'll pass things back over to Nicole.
Thanks, Layla. And just a quick reminder that we do have some time at the end for questions, but please feel free to send those at any point, and not just questions, but if you have a comment or an anecdote that you want to share, we welcome those as well. Yeah, use the chat or the Q&A function to send those in. But yeah, let's share a little bit more now about what we know of sexual abuse in detention and how it impacts lesbian, gay, and bisexual people particularly, or specifically. So again, this is national or data from a national survey that was conducted by the federal government, and it shows what we've been talking about, that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are exponentially more likely to be sexually victimized in detention, a lot more than their straight peers by both staff and other incarcerated people. Again, I think you could see that the numbers are staggering, but especially now in the second two columns where you're comparing straight men being victimized by other incarcerated people versus lesbian, gay, and bisexual people being sexually abused by their peers. The numbers of folks who are victimized by staff are also very high for LGB population, but I think the one that sort of always surprises people is that folks who are LGB are actually at higher risk of being sexually abused by other incarcerated folks. So again, just very staggering numbers there. So let's kind of review what sexual abuse looks like for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in detention. And by no means is this sort of an exhaustive list of all the dynamics of sexual abuse, but just to paint a picture of what they're experiencing. Protective pairing, you may have heard of that before, but that's When one incarcerated person or even a staff member agrees to protect another in exchange for servitude, typically in the form of sex with that person who's protecting them, quote unquote, and then that person holds power and influence over them. The dynamic may seem consensual and even affectionate from the outside, but the dynamic is truly a survival strategy for that person, where sex and service in exchange for protection is really their only way of surviving. And so this dynamic, it might be more clearly seen as abusive in the outside world, but when folks are incarcerated and they're in that isolated environment that comes with being in a carceral setting, it's much less clear and can be seen as consensual. And then certain protectors may also traffic or sell their partners to others, as we saw in Rodney's video, for example, where was sold for $20 of commissary, I think is what he said, to another person in the facility. And then a sort of other dynamic that we see, of course, due to the deprivation that folks experience in detention settings, is that lesbian and bisexual women may engage in survival sex work with, again, peers or staff to get their needs met that are otherwise not being able to get, whether that's commissary items or food or even like a housing change. Sometimes staff will use that in terms of controlling the survivor. So I won't move you to the facility that's closer to where your family is unless you do X, Y, and Z for me. Another form of sexual abuse that's prevalent in the LGBT population, but especially for lesbian and bisexual women, is the quote unquote corrective rape, where sexual assault is used as a corrective punishment to brutally reinforce societal norms. And so you may have heard things like a man saying to a lesbian woman, I'm going to fix you, right? I'm going to show you that you're wrong by raping you and showing you what sex is actually supposed to look like, right? So this corrective rape happens a lot to lesbian and bisexual women. And of course, we see a lot of staff coercion of lesbian and bisexual women to, again, have sex in exchange for items from the outside, or like I mentioned earlier, housing changes, work assignments, or other sort of benefits that they're not able to get through other ways. Staff may also engage in abusive or invasive searches, which are meant to humiliate and sexually abuse LGBT people. They're in the environment of corrections, they're everyday occurrences, searches are. So it's just a really easy way for staff, particularly, to abuse the population. And then we also receive many reports of pervasive verbal harassment against lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, which just really, again, reflects the sort of misogyny and anti-LGBTQ attitudes that we see in correctional institutions. All right, another discussion question. We know you guys love those too, but why might lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors of sexual abuse in detention not report or seek help? So what kind of challenges or barriers do you think that folks might have in terms of reporting sexual abuse? And you can put your answers in the chat. Again, doesn't have to be full paragraph or sentences, just quick thoughts is totally fine. Yeah, credibility, not being believed. Yeah, absolutely. Retaliation. Shame and stigma. Yep. Stitches get snitches. Wait, snitches get stitches. Sorry. Yeah. Which we hear still today, going back to the sort of media and how our society still talks about this stuff. We hear that a lot still. Embarrassed. Yeah, absolutely. These are all great responses and things that we hear from survivors all the time. So yeah, again, going back to the anti-LGBTQ discrimination we've been talking about, it's the main reason, which encompasses a lot of other reasons, of course, why people don't report. But within the culture of detention, facilities may see folks who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual as weak or as deviant, sexually promiscuous, or hypersexualized. And so all of these misconceptions lead people to think, oh, they wanted it, right? They asked for it. Or as Layla said, folks who are gay and have been accused of wanting to be incarcerated because they're surrounded by men now, right? Of course you want to be surrounded by men since you're gay. So that's the reason I see more answers coming in: shame and discrimination, embarrassed, yeah, depression, they don't have the emotional energy to report. Yeah, absolutely. These are all really, really great answers. Sometimes we see LGBT people are accused of wanting to be, again, in the same-sex environment. You're gay, you must want it, you must want to be surrounded, as we talked about. But there's also the concern that the abuse would be seen as consensual sex, so that they would then, in fact, be charged if they reported sexual abuse. As Layla mentioned, consensual sex is a rule violation in detention. And I'm talking about consensual sex between two incarcerated people, because obviously we know consensual sex cannot exist between staff and someone who's incarcerated. But consensual sex between two incarcerated people is a rule violation in detention, and it comes with significant disciplinary infractions in a lot of places. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who, for example, might be in a survival sex relationship like we talked about, or in a protective pairing relationship, they're at risk of being charged with consensual sex if they report abuse, because if the facility or the investigation turns out to say that it wasn't abusive, then it was consensual, which means I'm in trouble now for having sex. And witnesses and even the perpetrator, him or herself, may describe the relationship to the investigators as consensual, which then conceals the abusive dynamic that was actually at play, right? So that's another reason why folks don't report. We also know that survivors as a whole are at risk for retaliation after they report sexual abuse. But LGBT people are already likely to experience abuse and discrimination from staff. Reporting them just leaves them at an increased vulnerability for retaliation, which can include denial of work assignments, housing changes, which may put the survivor in danger or move them away from their friends and their support system, transfers to different facilities, as I mentioned earlier, access to their food, their personal items, their medical care, all sort of the basic needs. Let's not forget that someone who's incarcerated has very little control over those things. And then some staff pit other incarcerated people against those LGBT survivors, claiming that they're, as someone said, snitches, and instigating physical and sexual abuse against them. So again, these are all just fears, real fears that lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors of sexual abuse have, and reasons why they don't report. And then often reporting sexual abuse, particularly as someone who identifies as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, might mean that they're going to be put in protective custody or segregated housing, quote unquote, for their own protection, which at the end of the day, what it does is just really increases their isolation, and it reduces their access to programming and other resources. Maybe they might not have access to whatever class they were taking, or even to just their medical care, their physical health. They might not be able to go to rec. All these things that further isolate the person and impact their mental health. And again, the facility can say that it's for their safety, but as someone who is already feeling isolated because of their sexual orientation, is then also sexually abused, you don't want to be further traumatized by being put in isolation where you'll have very little access to anything, right? So again, that's just another reason why folks don't report sexual abuse. So the bottom line, as we all can agree and know, is that everyone should be safe in detention, but there are additional measures that facilities should be taking to ensure the safety of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in their custody to increase their dignity. And I know Layla covered some of this earlier, but under PREA, there's a number of requirements that the facility should be complying with in order to keep folks safe. But obviously, they need to be protected from sexual abuse. They need to have meaningful access to reporting options without facing retaliation, and they deserve to be treated with respect, which includes facilities taking responsibility for keeping them safe. And an example of a preventative measure to keeping LGBT people safe is properly screening them to assess for their risk of victimization and housing them accordingly. We know that staff should be receiving education on working with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and it's a PREA requirement, as Layla mentioned. But it's also just good corrections to understand your population and the dynamics and challenges that they may face. It's important that we reassess the way that consensual relationships are dealt with in detention and supporting sexual safety measures that would really relieve some of those fears that we just talked about amongst the lesbian, gay, and bisexual population, their own sexual safety and about reporting. If we, again, don't punish consensual sex the way that we do in correctional facilities. Another key measure that facilities can take to increase dignity for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in their custody is to allow for gender-affirming clothing and commissary. So that might mean allowing for a more masculine presenting lesbian who feels more comfortable in boxer shorts to be able to use those without requiring them to have some kind of dysphoria diagnosis, which is what happens in most facilities if you want to wear anything outside of the gender norms in that facility. But yeah, at the end of the day, we know that culture change is essential to increasing the dignity and the safety of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in detention, and staff should really be trained and held accountable for homophobic and misogynist attitudes. There should really be zero tolerance for sexual harassment from staff and from other incarcerated people. And these types of measures are really going to help change the male-dominated corrections culture that we've been talking about that really normalizes the degrading of the LGBT population. And I want to finish this section with a quick story that highlights some of the dynamics that we've been covering today. This is a bisexual survivor of sexual abuse in detention. Her name is Rosa. She was incarcerated in Kentucky for nonviolent offenses, and she was sexually abused at 2 different facilities in the state, both times by staff members. And so I'm going to read a little bit in addition to what's on the slide, but it all started when an officer, who was actually a captain, asked her to flash him. And then from that point on, he would come into her cell and sexually assault her. Rosa shared that he didn't physically hold her down, but that he threatened her. She had an infant daughter at the time, and he said that he would transfer her to a facility where she wouldn't be able to see her. So again, we've talked about that in today's presentation, just that control that staff have over a person in their custody and using that as leverage against them. At a different facility, a lieutenant would make her masturbate in front of him in exchange for dropping some of her disciplinary reports. And eventually this officer also sexually assaulted her. Rosa shared with us, "Today, I'm scared to let someone so much as pat my hand or give me a supportive hug, fearing that it will be misconstrued as a sexual advance. I'm paranoid when I shower. I feel dirty and used. I feel let down by those who were supposed to protect me. The warden, the jailer, the Department of Corrections." And then this is also not on the slide, but Rosa also shared, "I was abused badly as a child, mentally, physically, and sexually. I've been through many forms of therapy, and I know intellectually the rapes weren't my fault. But what hurts the most is that I am serving time for crimes that didn't physically harm anyone. I'm doing over half of a life sentence, and yet my rapists get to walk free." So we thank Rosa for sharing her story, and I will pass things back to Layla.
Thank you, Nicole. All right, when incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual people reach out to us and seek our services as advocates, we want to be prepared to respond with awareness of their unique needs. We're going to cover some tips and suggestions that we hope you all will find useful to your advocacy. But before we get into that, we wanted to highlight the story of Joe Booth, a powerful advocate in the movement to end rape in detention. Joe was an openly gay man who was raped during his time in a California state prison. He was targeted by a cellmate who tortured and sexually assaulted him over a period of 4 days due to his sexual identity. He reached out to JDI for support in 2010 after his release. And after his release in 2012, he became a member of JDI's Survivor Council. Here, Joe shares his experience of working with a rape crisis center advocate, someone who actually saw his humanity. He told us, "I had a rape crisis advocate. I cannot tell you how much of an angel she was. She was the first person to ask me what my first name was, and treat me like a person, not just a number. I'm a human being. And I really think Joe's words underscore how important advocates are for incarcerated LGBT survivors and incarcerated survivors as a whole, to validate their experiences, to treat them as people deserving of support as they navigate healing from sexual violence. The crucial support that Joe received from JDI and his local rape crisis center was a theme in his public speaking, especially to advocates who are beginning to work with incarcerated survivors. Joe was often featured in media coverage of sexual abuse in detention, and he was a mainstay at national sexual assault prevention conferences and policy forums. I know he touched many lives with his story and his advocacy, and his legacy lives on in the work that we do as advocates. One of the first things that you can do to support incarcerated LGBT survivors is what you're already doing now, which is learning more. Thank you again for being here with us today. Knowledge about the dynamics of detention environments and understanding how these dynamics impact LGBT survivors can help inform your advocacy work. Detention environments often amplify the issues we see in society as a whole, including anti-LGBT discrimination. Racism also plays a strong role in detention environments where racist ideologies and historical narratives that dehumanize and objectify people of color, in particular Black people, remain prevalent. Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are doubly impacted by systemic racism and homophobia and are disproportionately represented among incarcerated LGBT people. As advocates, it's important for us to keep these layers of oppression in mind as we think about the additional barriers the survivors we work with might be facing and how we can best serve them. Additionally, it's important to remember that some forms of sexual abuse LGBT people experience, such as protective pairing, survival sex work, and prison family dynamics, may appear consensual at first glance. Due to discrimination, isolation, sexualization, and the power dynamics at play, abuse against LGBT people is often concealed and overlooked. Of course, it is ideal for rape crisis center staff to reflect the population served, yet advocates from all backgrounds can be effective allies for LGBT survivors. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors need support from both heterosexual and LGBT advocates who are aware of their specific needs and vulnerabilities in custody. The different identities that you have as an advocate may impact how you are perceived by incarcerated survivors, especially initially. It's important to know that LGBT people have been underserved by support services and often must navigate discrimination and ignorance when trying to access services. It can be helpful to be prepared for this and to be available to put in additional time to establish trust. Often at rape crisis centers and other advocacy organizations, there may be only one dedicated PREA advocate focused on working with incarcerated survivors. This can pose a challenge when you're expected to be the point person to help your agency develop a nuanced understanding of the needs of incarcerated LGBT survivors. So if possible, we always recommend a team approach. The more people that understand the needs of the diverse populations we work with, the better. That can look like having as many staff as possible view webinars such as this one, attend trainings, and also keeping the topic of incarcerated survivors as a whole and incarcerated LGBT survivors specifically alive at your agency. When working with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, be sure to ask who they are out to at the facility, if anyone. Help keep the incarcerated LGBT survivor you're working with safe by only disclosing information about their sexuality to individuals they trust, being careful not to out them to the facility. Incarcerated LGBT people are the experts of their experiences and are aware of who they're able to disclose such information to, and if they're able to disclose it at all. It's possible that you as an advocate may be the only person an incarcerated LGBT survivor feels safe to come out to. This consideration also extends to how you address confidential mail to incarcerated LGBT survivors who may have preferred names or pronouns that they disclose to you. Always be sure to address mail with the incarcerated survivor's legal name. You can use preferred names and preferred pronouns in the body of the letter. It's also always best not to make assumptions about a person's sexual orientation based on their appearance, presentation, or even their sexual history. Let incarcerated LGBT survivors tell you who they are and how they identify, rather than assuming their experiences or the dynamics at play. For example, there are incarcerated men who have sex with men, but do not identify as being gay or bisexual. A woman may present in a butch or masculine manner to you, but she may not consider herself a lesbian. Sexuality is separate from how a person presents themselves. Furthermore, sexuality is fluid and people may change how they identify over time. Because of these factors, it may be helpful to simply ask any survivor if they identify as LGBT as a routine part of your intake process, rather than making assumptions about individuals. Once you're actually working with an incarcerated survivor, especially sexual minority survivors, you may need to allow for additional time to establish trust and build rapport. This may take longer than expected, as incarcerated LGBT survivors in particular have had their trust violated both by the abuser as well as the system and helping professionals time and time again. And then, just as you would with any survivor, discussing confidentiality and being very clear about what information will go where is crucial. Retaliation is a very real fear inside detention settings, especially for LGBT people already impacted by discrimination and disproportionate disciplinary response. So it's important to be upfront with the survivor about what you are not able to keep confidential so they can choose what they want to disclose to you. Now we'll highlight some additional advocacy practices to consider when working with incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors. As we discussed earlier, incarcerated sexual minorities are protected under PREA from being housed separately solely on the basis of their identity. If an incarcerated lesbian, gay, or bisexual person you're working with reports that they're being housed separately or kept in segregated housing because of their sexual orientation, this is a violation of PREA. Leveraging your agency relationship with the facility, you may advocate for your client to be housed safely and appropriately. But it's really important that you consult with your client prior to such advocacy and ensure that they provide consent and are prepared for potential retaliation of such advocacy. A survivor's LGBT identity may also be an important factor in the abuse they have experienced. However, not all LGBT survivors may be comfortable disclosing their sexual identity to corrections staff during investigatory interviews. If you have the opportunity to speak with the LGBT survivor you're working with confidentially, discuss their options and concerns in disclosing information about sexuality to corrections staff and support their decisions around disclosure. In providing accompaniment and advocacy to LGBT people during forensic examinations and investigatory interviews, also be prepared to challenge potential anti-LGBT views of staff who may perceive the survivor as deviant or hypersexualized, or may otherwise blame the LGBT survivor for the assault. Your supportive presence may help challenge discriminatory views of staff who lack the training or capacity to appropriately support LGBT survivors. It may be really traumatic for the already traumatized LGBT survivor to have to explain their identity or details of their sexuality to corrections and medical staff. And that's where you as an advocate can step in and offer support and model respectful communication as well. The language that we use to promote our services and reach survivors can really impact who ends up feeling welcome at our agencies. Historically, rape crisis centers have been geared towards serving heterosexual women who experience sexual violence from heterosexual male perpetrators. You may need to rethink your agency's outreach, messaging, and culture to ensure that your support services are inclusive of LGBT people. One way to do this is to use gender-neutral language when describing your services and the survivors that you serve. For example, using people of all genders or all survivors. It may also be helpful to name that people of all sexual orientations are welcome at your agency. So consider using the statement such as, our program offers counseling to all survivors of sexual violence, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. Inclusive language is a useful starting point. However, it's also important to specifically name that your agency provides services to the LGBT community. Include information on your website and literature that speaks directly to the needs of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Consider partnering with your local LGBTQ+ community organizations for additional training and relationship building. It would be really useful for all staff to attend sexual minority-focused trainings and become familiar with the needs, experiences, and obstacles lesbian, gay, and bisexual people face, and how to best serve and advocate for LGBT clients. One of the most important things you can do is get to know your local lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, conducting outreach to your local LGBT community, connecting with those working to advance LGBT rights locally, and participating in local pride events are just some suggestions to build the relationships and show up consistently as a supportive resource for LGBT folks. And it's also really important to keep abreast of national, state, and local legislation and social and political trends affecting LGBT people, and understand how this may impact your client. And one hint around that, we have national, state, and local elections coming up, which may be impacting LGBTQ+ folks, and it's just really important to be aware of that. And before closing, we wanted to highlight some agencies which provide various support services to incarcerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and the LGBTQ+ community as a whole. It may be really helpful to familiarize yourself with these agencies as resources to provide to the incarcerated LGBT people that you serve. The National Center for Lesbian Rights serves all members of the LGBTQ+ community and provides a legal helpline along with resources and information regarding LGBTQ+ discrimination and mistreatment in detention settings. Black and Pink, which has national and local chapters, provides an LGBTQ+ resource guide for incarcerated persons, as well as pen pal services. And Lambda Legal also provides a legal help desk and works to end discrimination against LGBTQ+ people and those with HIV. And if you're aware of another resource serving incarcerated LGBT folks, feel free to drop that in the chat as well, and we can tap into the wealth of knowledge that everyone brings here today. Also, be sure to contact your local and state LGBTQ+ community and advocacy centers, which may provide additional support and resources to incarcerated or re-entering lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And with that, I will pass it back over to Nicole.
Thanks, Layla. And we have reached the point in our webinar where we will answer any questions you all may have. If you do, please write those in the chat. But in the meantime, while you do that, I'm going to just share a couple more upcoming events to look out for. So we have our office hours next Wednesday. We'll host those via Zoom. It's basically for anyone who hasn't attended. It's an open forum for people to come with their questions, challenges, and successes around providing services to incarcerated survivors. It's a great opportunity to connect with others that are doing this work, and we hope to see you there, if not next Wednesday in one of our future office hours. We also wanted to mention that we'll be at NSAC, the National Sexual Assault Conference, which is going to be here in Washington, D.C., and starts on August 14th. So if you're coming to NSAC, we would love to have you at one of our multiple sessions. We have a mini track And we are also hosting with the PRIA Resource Center, we're hosting a meetup on service provision for incarcerated survivors. So if you are available, that'll be on Wednesday at 5 p.m. I think the room is still to be determined, but we'll be there and we hope to see you there. And then lastly, we have some upcoming webinars that are part of this series. So in September, we have one on providing services to incarcerated survivors who are deaf. And in October, we have one focused on services for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Both of those still need to be scheduled, but be on the lookout if you're not already on our mailing list and want to be added so that you can get all of our updates. Drop your email address on the chat or directly message Layla or I, and we'll make sure to get you added. Another quick thing I wanted to mention was that we have a coaching opportunity for anyone who's interested in individualized coaching for your agency. I'm dropping that link in the chat. It's for any advocates or rape crisis centers or even coalitions or corrections agencies as well who are looking to expand their services. It's free. It's one-on-one coaching with JDI. So please check it out if you're interested. And I did not move the slides, so there's the coaching one, but I did drop the link in, so if anyone's interested. And then lastly, here's information. Thank you so much for supporting this work. Our website has a wealth of information and other webinars that'll be posted as well. So if you want to come check out our resources, you can also follow us on social media. And lastly, you should be getting a survey that'll pop up once you close out of today's webinar, but I'm also sending the link in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback about today's webinar. As we've mentioned, this is a one in a series of 13, so we are always looking to improve. And if you have any feedback, please do share that with us. And then, yeah, with that, I'll go back to questions. I don't think we have a lot of time left, but happy to stick around if anyone does have questions. And yeah, just grateful for you all being here. Hope to see some of you at NSAC. I'll be there, as well as a couple more of my colleagues. I'm looking at your notes coming in. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And we will add at least one email that I saw come in here who's not on our list. We'll make sure to add you, Tamara. Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And again, if you do have any questions, Layla and I will stay on for a couple more minutes. But otherwise, it was great being with you all today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions down the road.